we there yet?
I feel sick.
Okay, well, as you probably know, I use quite a lot of reclaimed wood in my guitars, so I want to talk about that. So first of all, I want to kind of talk about the reasons why you might want to use reclaimed wood or buy a guitar with reclaimed wood. And really, it kind of begins with the idea that I hate waste. And wood and trees. Wood is a valuable resource. And trees are living beings like we are. And they deserve a bit of respect. So, you know, wood should be looked after, and it should be treasured, and it should be valued. And when an object made of wood becomes unusable because it's got to the end of its life for one reason or another, it's very often the case that the wood itself, the material it's made from, is fine and it's got plenty more life left in it. So there's really no reason why we shouldn't keep reusing wood. And the only reason we don't do that is the time it takes to process a piece of wood from a piece of furniture or a door or whatever it is into the next thing it has to be. And mostly, I would say most of the wood, reclaimed wood I obtain doesn't cost me anything. And therefore, the cost to me is the time it takes to process it, which includes collecting the wood, making sure there are no nails or screws in it, sawing it up, for which I have to put a different blade on the bandsaw and so on. So there's, you know, I might get some free wood and people think, oh, it's great, but it might take me a day to collect it and process and chop it up to get it to the state where it would be in if I bought it from a luthier supplier. So it's not free, really. It's just a different way of acquiring wood. And if you can reuse some wood, then a new tree is not being cut down for that wood to be available to you. And very often it's of good quality. It's often of, if you're using a piece of wood that's 100 years old, it's very likely to be from a tree that hasn't been grown too fast, that's old growth wood. It's going to be air dried for 100 years, which is worth something. It's going to be seasoned, it's going to be stable. So there's a lot of good reasons for using reclaimed wood, but I think my favourite reason is there's always a story there. There's a connection to something in its previous life. And people really like a story behind the guitar. That's why people like vintage guitars. They have a mojo because, you know, this was made in the Martin factory in 1872 and so carved the neck, and there's a story there with a vintage guitar. And you can have the same sort of story and vibe and mojo with a piece of reclaimed wood. And sometimes that piece of wood will have a connection to the person who buys the guitar, because they might supply the wood to you. And this was my grandmother's blanket chest. You know, there can be a connection to a human event, which is really, everybody likes a story, don't they? You like to be connected to something. So every piece of wood has got its own story, which is unique to that piece of wood. It's not a generic product you can buy in any shop in any city in the country. It's a unique thing, and it's got its own history. Anyway, for me, it kind of started with the wood that I use for bracing. And I use Douglas fir for all my bracing, and I have done for most of my career. And it began with the door to my house. The back door of my house was rotting at the bottom. About the last couple of inches at the bottom of the door had rotted, and we needed to replace the door, so I took it off and just noticed how fine the grain was. And then I'd just started in guitar making at this time and thought, I wonder what this would be like for bracing. I didn't even know it was Douglas fir. It was just a nice, straight, fine-grained wood. And I had a visit from a friend came to stay, a guy called David Dye, who sells tone wood to guitar makers. And he said, "Oh, your doors are Oregon pine." Oh, are they? Okay. And I later found out that Oregon pine is another name for Douglas fir. And then I started looking into it, and people were saying, "Oh, this has got great qualities, it's very stiff." The roof of our house is made, the structure of the roof is made of Douglas fir. And it's known in carpentry circles as being very stiff wood. So if you have a long span, you use Douglas fir for the beam. So the roof is Douglas fir. All the doors are Douglas fir. And the house, which was built in the early 1930s, is part of an estate. And this is true of the whole estate. So first it started with our back door, which is all gone now, it's all been used up. But then we used to have a rubbish collection on Saturday morning every 2 weeks, and everybody would gather out. It was a community event, bring all your old rubbish out, and a truck would come round. Not like the bin men, but this was, you bring all your old stuff out onto the green outside. And this guy was coming down the road with 5 doors cut in half. So I intercepted him before he got to the dumping ground and said, "Can I have your doors?" "Yeah, you can have the doors." So that was quite a lot of Douglas fir. These are panel doors, so you've got a rail either side, 3 horizontal rails, and the panels are plywood. And that is that's what one of the uprights looks like, sort of 6.5 feet long. So I've been using that for soundboard bracing for maybe 25 years. And it's fantastic wood. It's 90 years old. And of course I had to try what would it be like for a soundboard. Now this stuff is only about 4 inches wide. So this is a Douglas fir top, but it's 4-piece. So not only is there a glue joint in the centre, there's another one there, another one here. And that is vintage wood, so it's instant vintage guitar. It's 90-year-old wood. And what happens, I mean, I'm not too clear on the science, but wood has liquid resins in it. And over a period of decades after it's cut, these resins harden into kind of crystalline structure. And that may be some of why an old guitar sounds the way it does. And of course this is 90 years old, so it's kind of arrived at that state.
Is that what people are trying to do when they bake the tops?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. You've heard about torrefied wood. Yeah, I apologise. But it's almost like torrefied. The process of thermo-treating wood is doing something very similar to that. It's kind of boiling off some of the more volatile compounds. And
saying earlier, the Spanish, builders in the 19th century kept all their wood on the roof, under a metal roof on top of it, and it used to heat every day. Used to bake it, and then it cooled down at night. It baked again, it cooled down at night. So by the time 4 or 5 years later, it was really well aged, seasoned.
Yeah. So if you can use aged wood in new instruments, you're going to get a different kind of result. And I guess the next stage for me, this is like talking about an addiction, isn't it? The next stage of my addiction was mahogany. Now, here in the UK, we had a huge empire, and we had access to rainforests all over the place that we could plunder and steal from. So there's a huge amount of really high quality mahogany furniture around. And in the last 10 years, the value of mahogany furniture has plummeted. It's kind of worth 1/5 of what it was a while ago. So there's mahogany to be had. And you have to be choosy. You can't just use any mahogany. There's crappy stuff and really good stuff. And the more you see of it and the more you work with it, the more you start recognising what the good stuff is. And the good stuff tends to be light in weight, kind of golden in colour. And when you're playing it, you don't want it to be really fibrous and carroty. And this is an example of some really, really nice mahogany. And I'll tell you the story about this in a bit, because that's a story that relates to...
So that guitar of Lynn's that was made, that one, if you turn the back on there, that was a 1780 Georgian dining room tabletop, cut up. Same wood's used in the mandolin, so if you buy that win that mandolin, that's from a 1780 Georgian dining top.
So that wood's got another life, and it's a kind of reincarnation. You give...
The neck also is from a Victorian bedstead, so that's got a lot of stories to tell, that neck.
Well, I think for me it started with using mahogany for necks. And when I was first starting out, I went to an auction in Lincoln, and they had a bed headboard for sale. It was 6 foot wide, which is a huge bed. It was clearly had a walnut veneer on it, so I kind of assumed it was plywood. Anyway, there were no bids, and then the auctioneer says, "Who'll give me £1 for it?" So of course I stick hand. I got enough wood for about 15 necks for £1. This is, and when I stripped off the veneer, it's this beautiful mahogany. So the mahogany was the core wood, and it's made to look like walnut, but it was like the mahogany was the throwaway wood. And this was, it's not just mahogany, it's M&S. No, it's not M&S mahogany. But it's really nice stuff. And if you buy mahogany now, like mahogany neck, it tends to be quite fibrous and not very nice and twisty grain and all the things. So the more you gather this stuff, the more you get sensitised to what the good stuff is and what to look for. And the other thing you really have to not be caught out by when you're looking at old furniture is veneered wood, because a huge amount of furniture is veneer, where you get a softwood, a pine panel with a veneer on it. And the way to tell, if you look, if I wanted to know if this was a solid table or not, you can look at the end of the table, and if you see the end grain, that suggests it's a solid piece of wood. If on here you've got grain running along like that, and the grain on the top's doing that, it's clearly a veneer. So you have to be a bit careful, and I have been caught out buying what I thought was a nice wardrobe of mahogany, and oh dear, it's veneer. You know, you've got that much mahogany, 0.5 millimetre or something, which is no use to anybody. And the other thing that is the bane of the reclaimer's life is nails and screws. Because if you want to make a back and sides, you've got to resaw this stuff to not more than 5 millimetres thick, really, which involves putting it through a bandsaw and cutting that deep. And if there's a nail in there and you hit a nail, that bandsaw blade is going to lose all its sharpness. And once its sharpness is gone, you don't get a straight cut. So you've really got to try and identify where there are nails and screws. And I've got a little handheld metal detector, and you can kind of scan the wood. But even so, there's still sometimes get away, and you can tell from the sound when the blade hits a nail. It'll cut through it, no problem. But after that, the keenness has gone off the blade. And when you're doing a really deep cut like that, as soon as the blade isn't sharp, it starts wandering. And if you're dealing with a piece of wood that thick that you want to cut in half, you can't really afford any wonder, because you could actually wipe out one of the halves altogether. So you've really got to be careful of stuff like that. And I got some wood from a pub bar recently, some mahogany. It was a music pub, actually. And it was nice mahogany, but the pain there was, it had been done quite recently, and they'd used a staple gun. So it's full of staples, and when you grab them to pull them out, they just snap off. So you can't actually remove them from the wood. So you either have to cut that bit of wood off, or kind of gouge around it and pull it out. So, and it can get to a point where it's not worth doing. Because as I said, you know, there is a lot of processing involved with reclaimed wood on the whole. And the other thing you want to try and get is a quarter sawn figure. Do you understand what's meant by quarter sawn wood? It basically, the tree has got growth rings, and if you look at the end of a board of wood, when it's quarter sawn, the growth rings are vertical to the surface, perpendicular to the surface. Most wood is cut on mostly they'll put a tree trunk through a saw and they'll cut slice, 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 which means most of the slices have got the growth rings going like, sort of curving like that. And because wood shrinks more around the ring than it does across the ring, if you've got a curve like that, a flat board will, as it dries, it will cut like that, because the shrinkage is pulling it. And what quarter sawn wood doesn't do that, because the grain is vertical, it shrinks evenly in every dimension. So it's more stable. And when you're doing a big panel, like that or like that, it's pretty important to have, particularly on the top, you want quarter sawn wood. And that's another advantage actually of doing a 4-piece top. Because what often happens on a board is you get nice quarter sawn wood, and then as the board moves, it can kind of veer across like that. Because there's only certain parts of the tree where you can get quarter sawn figure. So if you're using narrower boards, as in a 4-piece top, you can keep the quarter sawn figure across it's easier to keep it across a narrower width than a broader width. And so it enables you to use wood that otherwise you might reject because it was going too far off the quarter if you insisted on half the width of the guitar. It doesn't have to be a 2-piece top or a 2-piece back. Anyway,
Does it mean if the whole top's quarter sawn, it has to come from a bigger tree?
yeah, you would need a bigger trunk because you're coming from the centre. You can't go across the centre because the middle of the tree is very unstable. It's called the pith, a bit middle, pith. Yeah.
Is that the sapwood?
No, the sapwood is on
Sapwood's
the
on the
outside.
Okay,
The sapwood is the live bit where all the nutrients and water go up and down.
okay.
And that's always on the outside of the tree, and that tends to be a bit softer.
I mean, I know it's pretty when you see it on guitar backs of like a strip of sapwood. Is it any less stable than the rest
Well,
of
it
the
depends on the wood. I think for a lot of woods, particularly the rosewoods and stuff, it can, as you say, it's no less bad structurally, but it can provide a nice feature.
Yeah, really pretty.
Yeah. So, this guitar, I used to teach an evening class in guitar making. One of my students was a church warden at the church in Nottinghamshire, and there was a harmonium in the church, which was the church organ, for the best part of 130 years. And when they took it out to upgrade it to a modern organ, he got the wood, and because he'd made a couple of guitars, he recognised it as potential guitar wood. And he wrote to me and said, "Do you want some of this black walnut?" So I went over and he had some for himself, and he gave me some, and some to a couple of other people. And I got enough for about two guitars and a neck, back and sides and neck. And this is fabulous wood. Usually when the wood looks fairly boring and straight lines, that's a sign it's quarter sawn. If it's got big loops in it and stuff, that usually means it's flat sawn. So that in other words, the more boring it looks, usually the more structurally sound it is. The really pretty stuff is often where the grain is going all over the place, and that's why it's pretty. But this is fairly staid, straight grain quarter sawn wood. And this is from an organ that was made in America in, I think, about the 1890s. So this wood's about 130 years old. And it's been vibrating to music for a long time, about 130 years. So what we've got here is a reincarnated musical instrument. It's the second time round having a go at making some music. And that earlier I was talking about connections and stories, and that's kind of to make a musical instrument out of another musical instrument, to recycle that wood, I think it's just a really nice story and a really nice connection. And to kind of honour that, in the rosette and the headstock, I thought, what can we do that says I'm from an organ? So this is a kind of keyboard motif, 2 black notes, white space, 3 black notes, white space, and the same one here. So it's a kind of subtle nod to the origins without being too kind of too cheesy about it. Yeah, and that kind of brings me back to, I think the first time I did that sort of thing was I made an all mahogany guitar from the top of a grand piano. I don't know, and I brought it to Halifax one time.
Yeah,
And the very next year there was a songwriting competition, which Paul won.
Yes.
And we're listening to Paul's song and it's about a piano. And suddenly in the last verse, he mentions me and I made a guitar out. So that was clearly a story that caught your imagination. Which brings me to another forum member, which is John here. And John got in touch with me, 3 months ago or something?
Yeah, about that.
And you had a piece of furniture which was made from an old square piano. The square piano is a predecessor of the pianoforte from, what do we say, mid sort of 18th century.
Yeah, it's Regency.
Yeah. And John offered this to me and sent me a photo. Do you want to tell them what you told me earlier about why you wanted
Well,
to
when
have
we
it?
moved to where we live now, 38 years ago, we needed a desk. We got a big house, a big country type house. And instead of just buying a desk, we looked around some of the antique shops and I knew there was this converted square piano. By a square piano, in typical language misuse, it's actually rectangular. And it's a bloody big thing. It was
Heavy.
sort of the size of, from where it says private, more or less to this corner here. We're in the process of moving house, and when you move house, particularly if you downsize a bit, you start looking around some of your favourite bits and think, don't think I can take that anymore. And the converted piano, which was by now a beautiful desk with pull-out drawers and little cubbyholes all the way around, we decided it had to go. And as Adrian mentioned earlier, the amount of money we paid for it in the first place, appreciation and value didn't come into it, because where we paid a 4-figure sum for it, I rang at various people, and the best offer I got was about £150, £175, which was probably understandable to some degree, because someone had to come and fetch it, they had to clean it, they had to do whatever they wanted, they had to get a markup on it, and they probably had to deliver it to somebody else and whatever it was. So here we were faced with this thing which we loved and cherished, which had once been a lovely musical instrument that appeared to have come to the end of its useful valued life, and the option was just to cart it off to an auction house, and someone no doubt would have used it until they got fed up with it. And having sort of met Adrian, I first met Adrian when I went over to his, they had an open day for the guitar making school that they have at Newark, and spent a very pleasant day there, and then of course bumped into him on this forum a few years ago, and I thought, well, the commercial side of me says 150 quid, 150 quid, and the other side said, wouldn't it be nice if it ended up as a musical instrument again? So hence I rang up Adrian and said, do you fancy coming and have a look at it? Because particularly the top, it had a pull down, open up top, which was one solid piece of mahogany, was just beautiful, beautifully grained. And then there were side pieces, etc., which were very nice as well. So he came over in his van, had a look at it, and between us,
We wrestled it out.
he was like, we took the legs off, and right said Fred. Off it went in the back of the van, and then of course about 6 or 7 weeks ago I saw one of his posts on Facebook which showed that he'd actually cut the some backs from this, and the only agreement I had with him was I didn't want any money, I didn't want any discount from a guitar, but I wanted to see what it turned into. And my surprise was when I arrived here today, that's it sitting there. Or part
Yeah,
of it.
so I'll talk a bit about when I got it home. I had this very heavy thing, which I had to get out on the driveway and chop up, essentially. And a bit like the veneer story, most of the mahogany was thin panels on the outside, and most of the structure was heavy pine frames about this sort of section. So most of it was pine. And there were nails and screws to be worked around and stuff. So I spent quite a lot of time just carefully taking it to pieces, making sure nails weren't in the wrong place and everything like that. And also cutting up the pine frame because I couldn't just leave it there, I had to use it. And I struck on the idea, I don't know if any of you know much about electric guitars, but when Fender first started making solid electrics, they made quite a few prototypes in pine, with pine bodies. And now pine-bodied Telecasters has become a bit of a thing. So I actually worked out from the pine frame that I could get enough to glue up an electric guitar body, which I've done, and I've cut that out. I haven't brought it with me. So the pine wasn't completely right. The rest of it was nice, useful firewood. But the bits that were useful were, as John said there, these panels like this, which are about, this was kind of hinged flat, wasn't it? And you can see, I mean, under the French polish finish, it looks lovely. It's got this inlay. And I was able, with a bandsaw, to cut that in half and still have enough thickness for back and sides. Which was great, because when you bandsaw this stuff, my normal bandsaw blade is a 1/2 inch, which is great for most jobs, and you're never cutting a deeper cut than about that. This requires a cut that deep, which is about the maximum my bandsaw will go to, and I have to put a 3/4 inch blade on it to get a straight cut and a fresh blade, and it cut through that really nicely. You can see how straight the cut is, and what you end up with is that. And do you know what book matched wood is? It's basically, you cut something in half and you open it so that these are the two cut faces. And the result of that is that the grain pattern is symmetrical.
Clear image.
And that's why I've marked it like this. And the reason we've got a number 1 here and a number 2 there is that that's one guitar body, and then in line with that you've got another guitar body. And what I'm planning to do with this is do a mahogany top guitar. So the top and the back will come out the same board, basically. And to my eye, I don't know if you can appreciate it, but that is really nice mahogany. It's the right colour, it's the right weight. The grain is straight, and it's not troublesome and curling all over the place. And then for the sides, this was another panel. There's a nice little inlay string on it. And again, that's a book-matched pair that will make a pair of sides. So this wood here, which is all from John's piano, is sufficient to make a mahogany top guitar, back and sides, front, back and sides, all from from the same wood, which is 250 years old.
This is from a desk that was about the size of a mini.
It was a big desk.
Yeah, well, that's all you got out of it that was useful. That's the point I'm trying to make.
No, well, this is also from that same stock. Back and sides of this one. And the front of this one is the Douglas fir that I've shown you. So this was one of the uprights of the door, right? And I've sawn that on the bandsaw. And each time I saw it, I'll put a number on the two faces off the saw, number 10, so that I know that's a book-matched pair. And I also write it on the back, number 9. Now, obviously, you can't use that as a 10 and a 9, but you've got the option of one or the other. And when you cut furniture up, there are features you have to work around. This is where the dowels would come through from the cross pieces. So obviously, that's you can only use the wood between there and there. And then of course it goes down the sequence, that's 8 and 8. You've got some screw holes here, which you can't use. Here's one of the dowel pieces. But I can do a 4-piece top, or I can even do a 6-piece top, because as the guitar gets wider, you know, if my wood was only this wide, the only bit I need is a piece that long to add on here. I don't need the full length of the soundboard. So often you can just put a wing on here. Most of that is sitting over the top of a lining inside, so structurally it's pretty sound. And if you do the glue joints properly, that's as strong as a solid wooden top. There's no structural loss by having 4 glue joints, 3 glue joints instead of 1. And finally, the neck on this one is from a friend of mine phoned me up and said the local post office club had a skip outside and they were breaking up snooker tables. So that neck is one of these. This is the edge of a snooker table, and it had green baize nailed onto it, and that's what I made the neck from. Now you can see there's some nail holes here, and when you make a neck, you would expect sort of maximum depth about 24 millimeters, but 6 mil of that is the fingerboard, so you only need 18 millimeters. 18 max, which is what, 3/4 of an inch. So most of these nail holes are not going to be in the way. They should be fine. So you kind of learn to work around nails. And also, if there was a bit I couldn't use, I've got enough length in this. If I make a neck, there's going to be that much I don't need, which means I can be selective about where I make the cuts and avoid some of the nail holes. And even if that, you know, if I don't avoid all the nail holes, the nails are part of the history of a piece of wood. So this one, for instance, there was a nail hole there, and I drilled it out and I put a plug in it. There's a thing called a plug cutter, which is like an inside-out drill. Instead of drilling a hole, it cuts a plug to a certain size. So you can cut from. So I drilled this hole out to a clean 6 millimeter. Then I made a 6 millimeter plug from the wood that I cut off here. So it's from the next piece of wood, so the grain matches exactly. So I don't think there's any shame in kind of accepting that this wood had a previous life and there's some sign of that in the wood. You know, it's not perfect, but it says this is where I came from, and it's part of the story that we're talking about. So that is that's a guitar kit, basically.
Have you left the finish on those for sort of demonstration purposes, so it's obvious that it's reclaimed? Would you normally take the finish off completely?
Yeah,
Right.
because, I mean, this is just as it's come out of my workshop. For instance, the neck is going to need a fingerboard gluing on it, it's going to need gluing surfaces for the headstock, so you've got to get you've got to clean all this varnish off.
Sorry, what I mean is, have you left, I mean, obviously it would need to be cleaned, but ordinarily, if you were just putting it into wood stock, would you completely take all the finish off both sides?
Only when I need to.
Okay, so you wouldn't sort of prepare it in advance?
No, not till I'm making the guitar, because you never know quite how much you're going to need or not need for that individual project. So I kind of leave it as wide open as I can before the event. Plus I tend to be busy, so I'm not going to be spending time cleaning up all this wood until I need to, really. But it is nice to leave some kind of trace of its history. And the other part of this guitar, which is not exactly reclaimed, but all the black wood on this is bog oak, which is from an oak tree that was growing 5,300 years ago. Which was just think about that, what that tree saw in its lifetime. That was before Stonehenge was built. So it's kind of that tree, which I work with a plane like a normal piece of wood, was growing in a completely different world. So that's also part of the story.
Is that from the Norfolk stuff?
It's from Kent, I think, most of
Well, no, I know I bought, because he lived about 20 minutes away from his shop was about 20 minutes away from where I lived, so I had to go there a lot.
Well, I bought it from somewhere in
But I think it
don't
originally came from one of the
It'll be
Norfolk
English
bogs. Yeah.
Bog Oak,
Yeah.
but I don't know
Yeah,
exactly.
the
where it's
5,000. It's got this little label on,
Yeah.
carbon dated to 5,000
Yeah,
years.
yeah. But it's a bit mind-blowing when you're working that wood, thinking about what the world was like when that tree was growing.
You talked earlier about
Dinosaurs.
the 90-year-old top on that.
Sorry?
The 90-year-old wood for the top for that guitar.
Yeah.
Is that different to work than a new Spruce, for example?
Well, I haven't really worked any new Douglas fir because this is what I've got, but it has a kind of crystalline quality. It's a bit like, when you get a loaf of sugar. No, I know that's an old-fashioned thing.
We're not one as old as you.
In my day,
Well,
you buy a loaf of sugar for a farthing. But it seems to have a kind of crystalline quality. And I don't know if that's to do with what I was talking about with the resins hardening over time, crystallizing. There's definitely a kind of, I've used spruce for bracing, modern spruce, and that's very different. This has got a very, you can almost feel the chisels shearing through the crystal structure. It's hard to describe, but it is unlike, say if you bought a piece of modern pine, it's totally different from that. But I think I've kind of stuck with that wood, A, because I've got lots of it, but also I think when you get to know a particular wood and how to work with it and how to get the best out of it, it's like you were saying, you're developing a skill, you're developing a sensitivity to that particular wood, so you stick with it because you know what you're doing with that wood. Whereas if you're bitting about, if you suddenly go to a different kind of wood for the bracing every time you build a guitar, you're not so familiar with what the properties of that wood are and how to make it work for you, how to get the best out of it. So yeah, I think there is something, because I've kind of specialised in that, I haven't got the breadth of experience to say, yes, this is very different from that, but it works for me, And I've used Douglas fir for my bracing in nearly every guitar I've built since about number 3 or something. So it's part of what I do. Kind of slight detour, but if I'm not using reclaimed woods, I tend to use more local woods rather than tropical woods. When I was teaching guitar making at Newark College for about 14 years, I've just finished last summer, but we had a project there called the Leonardo Guitar Research Project, which was a European-wide research project comparing the use of local European woods to tropical woods in guitar making. And we would make pairs of guitars and blind test them to see if people could hear the difference, one tropical or one local woods. And they couldn't, basically. The results were coming out sort of 50-50 when people were asked for their preference, what they liked the sound of best. And that inspired me to really investigate and look at what woods we have locally that are really good tone woods for use. Things like cherry, this is pear on the back and sides, which is a really nice tone
It's a
wood.
very old traditional tone wood.
Well, this is what I was going to say. Tropical woods have only been around for use in Europe since 1700s, really. And before that, we were using pear and cherry and yew and maple. And there's so many good tone woods locally. The fruit woods tend to be really nice. Cherry is a fantastic tone wood. Pear is
good
really good.
necks.
All the white wood on this guitar is holly, which is, this is from a local tree. And holly has a really nice, tight, crisp sort of grain to it. And it's really nice for inlay work. And the nut on this is holly. Because it has a 0 fret, you can have a wooden nut, because the nut's just a string spacer. It's not like a bone thing where the strings need a hard surface to be on. And the top is yew, which is an unusual choice for a top wood. But yew is kind of use a very springy wood. It's quite unusual. It's like a softwood because it's an evergreen, but it's not soft. It's kind of technically a softwood because it's evergreen. And it's got a kind of look of softwood about it when you look at the grain. But it's quite hard and it's very springy, so you get this kind of bounce to it, which is really nice. So when you're thinking about guitar, don't just look at the sort of rosewoods, ebonies and mahoganies. There's so many great woods grown locally around here, and they're often not available as commercial timbers, because things like yew, it's never grown as a commercial wood, so you only find it if you're going to a sawmill that's got some local woods in, or you get a tree that's been cut down, or something like that. Laburnum's another one, makes great fingerboards and bridges. And that's a garden tree, it's never grown commercially. So you'll never find it in a, really, as lumber from a wood cellar. You find it by scratching around and going in people's gardens with your chainsaw. But the nice thing is I've been doing this for a while and I now have a reputation, so that if people will ring me up on a fairly constant basis saying, you know, I've got this old bedstead or wardrobe or door made in mahogany, do you want it? And I can never say no. And sometimes it's rubbish and it's not really usable and it can go on the fire. And sometimes it's, like John's example, it's a wonderful piece of, you know, something really special. So, but it's nice to kind of be known as the person people can come to if they don't want to throw something away, but it's not useful anymore. So I kind of...
Do you accept IKEA?
Yeah. No, IKEA is not on the menu. But
Give it a few years and everybody will be waxing lyrical on tone MDF.
yeah, oh yeah, with the right spin on it. Yeah.
Adrian, do you have a favourite wood that you like to work with that you think is better than something else? What's your favourite combination to make a guitar? I know that's a very broad question, but do you have something that's...
Well, I don't specifically have, oh, I like this wood better than any other, because the combinations are interesting, but it's kind of, what turns up is interesting. I mean, I do like working with stuff like cherry and some of the local woods I mentioned. Cherry is a really nice wood. It's not only a great tone wood, it's got all these, it kind of looks brown, but when you look closely there's orange in there and green and brown and yew has purple in it and orange. And there's all sorts of subtle stuff going on in there.
Where did the wood come from? I think it's your personal guitar. It's got Brazilian on the back.
Yeah, that's Brazilian rosewood. Back, sides, fingerboard, head plate. There used to be in Derbyshire a place near Millersdale that sold tone woods for guitar makers, and it was a farmyard basically. And they would have all sorts of stuff in there, and they used to have quite a lot of reclaimed Brazilian rosewood from old farmyards and stuff. And I went one day and I got this board of Brazilian rosewood, about probably 35 millimetres thick, about 6 inches, 150 mil wide, and this long, and it was 40 quid. And I got 5 slices out of it, which was 2 sides and a 3-piece back. And then they sold blocks of Brazilian rosewood for about 20 quid, and you could get 6 or 7 fingerboards out of it. It was crazy, ridiculous.
How long ago was this?
Oh, this maybe 20 years ago. I don't know if any of you went to the RMMGA meetings, but at one time they were in a place called Hargate Hall in Derbyshire, very near Millersdale. And when we used to go out to the meet, it was a meet like this, a weekend, and it always involved a trip to this farmyard where you got the most amazing timbers. But that was kind of, that was 20 years ago I made that guitar, and it was before I really got involved more with the local wood thing, and I was kind of, it's still mostly reclaimed wood in that guitar. I think the neck is from an old bank counter, really nice bit of mahogany, and the rest is Brazilian, and then I think a Sitka spruce top off the shelf.
It's such a nice guitar.
Yeah, But yeah, I mean, I wasn't really so aware of the whole. I was still using reclaimed wood for the bracing and the neck and stuff.
More local now.
But it was still a kind of scrounge guitar. Get some bits and make the best out of them. Because I think it's part of the, like I said at the beginning, I think we need to value wood, which means getting the absolute maximum yield out of it, which is where you might make a 4-piece top or a 4-piece back, because you're using wood that would otherwise, you would say it's not big enough, because it's not wide enough. Because most people, if you're using a 2-piece traditional back with a centre seam, the guitar's got to be at least, the board has got to be at least half as wide as the whole guitar. But if you say, well, 4-piece is fine, you only need a board that wide. So you've got access to a whole lot more wood that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And I think just being sort of resourceful and clever and thinking about it, how you're going to do it in an efficient way, it minimises the amount of wood you use. You know, we're entering a very critical time where we've got to look after trees and resources and not throw away stuff until we've got maximum use out of it.
Sonically, would it make a difference whether it's 2-piece or 4-piece or 16-piece or?
No, not really. If you glue the joints properly, you make good joints and you glue them properly. It doesn't, I mean, everybody says if you do a good glue joint, it's stronger than the wood itself anyway.
Some of the great guitars in the 19th century, they had to build with the wood they could get. You know, there was no tone wood suppliers cutting boards ready. They just used whatever wood was available. And I think some of Toy's guitars have got 7-piece backs.
And not book matched.
Not book matched, or
No.
a 3-piece top. You know, so they use whichever wood.
Because, you know, apart from the glue joints on the back of that, you've got a whole lattice of bracing, which is sort of reinforcing all those glue joints anyway.
Couple of quick stories, one of which will make you cry. I'm sorry about that, but it will do. Many years ago in an American guitar forum, we got the chance of getting some wood that came from the deck of Douglas Fairbanks Jr.'s yacht. Right? Now that yacht, with his reputation, could tell a lot of stories. Right? And we got some of this wood, but of course it was on the yachts, they drill and peg all the boards down, so we had to drill them all out and repeg it wood and had all built guitars. So that was, they made fabulous. Well, what a story! You know, this top guitar is made from Douglas Fairbanks' yacht. You know?
It should have been Douglas fir.
It should have been.
The Douglas F guitar.
Now, I thought my story was going to make you cry, but that's anyway. The second one, you know, I'm a scientist. I was at Imperial College for many years, right, as a student, and the health and safety people, when they all they said, got to change all your laboratory bench tops, right? And the laboratory bench tops were 100 years old, 75 mil thick, mahogany, in all the laboratories, had to be taken. The only problem where they had the sinkholes cut out and things, but you know, you could work plenty of space between them. So they cleared them all out, and I put my little hand up and said, you know, can I buy that wood, you know, and all that wood. Because it made fabulous guitars, because it was perfectly quarter sawn, 100-year-old mahogany, and they said, no, because they've been used in laboratories. They said that's physics laboratory, you know, but because it's been used in a laboratory, it's got to be burnt. 3.5 tons of mahogany.
It's awful.
That's just criminal, isn't it?
That's what I said, you know. They said, no, it's got to be burnt.
Why is it blaming you?
But I mean, that
Bloody Germans.
Ruining everything.
that is an example of wood you just can't get anymore.
No.
No.
CITES 2 listed.
We're talking about old growth trees that were harvested 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's no substitute for that wood. You can't find it anymore.
The trees aren't there.
So it's not just about recycling stuff, it's about accessing a quality of wood that's no longer available as fresh timber.
Have you ever worked with like the new growth Adirondack?
No. I've got a set of some. I don't know if it's new growth.
Right. No, I you know, for a long time it was like, oh, Adirondack is the holy grail, and so
Yeah,
everyone was planting, and then they've got this new growth with, you know,
very wide range.
yeah, and I've heard it's kind of crap. I just wondered if you had a good piece of Sitka will beat it every time, and I didn't know if you
Well,
had
I
any
think
experience with it.
I think you don't want to be too kind of hung up on a species, because you can have as much variation within a species as you can
Within a
between
tree.
species.
Yeah,
So you can't always say this species is the best wood for this.
no, I
It's
think
a
it got
ridiculous-
Americans got very caught up in our Adirondack